Well, it's not always like this. Right, I think we can probably start, and other can just join in as we go or watch the recording. So this welcome to this talk about data analytics in the age of privacy. Before starting, I would like to introduce the speakers. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Louise Dideritz. I work in growth at Castor, and Castor is a data catalog company, which mission is to help organizations find and understand their data in a collaborative manner. We're also glad to welcome Marco, who's a managing partner at Data, which is a German tech company with a focus on data intelligence and analytics, which develops scalable solutions and strategies along the entire data value chain. So Marco is also the founder of the largest meetup on digital analytics in Germany. Then we're also honored to have Mira. Mira is the director of data and analytics at Voorhees, which is an American law firm based in Ohio, Columbus. So before that, Mira is involved in the analytics practice at JP Morgan and Abercrombie. So she will bring an interesting perspective on privacy matters that she's dealt with in the past. Now I'd like to introduce the main issues around the theme of data privacy and analytics to kind of set the tone for the conversation that we'll have after. So data privacy comes with a lot of challenges. So we're facing a very interesting paradox in which we've never collected so much data, yet data has never been so protected in a way it makes sense. But in the past few years, we had stifling data regulations that have emerged and tightened across all territories, regardless of whether it is the US or Europe. So it's a problem regarding all continents. So just to go back on where it started, so the first data protection regulations started in the 1970s in Hessen in Germany, so close to Marco. And since then, these data regulations have kept increasing. Data compliance has only really became a worldwide challenge in the second half of the 2010s with the emergence of GDPR and HIPAA, which you probably all have heard of, and other regional regulations on personal data privacy. So this created a real emergency to handle new requirements. The problem is that handling these requirements always comes at a cost. And mainly it poses three key questions to data-driven organizations. So the first one is, how can we make data protected yet accessible? How can we conduct analysis from limited data in the sense that a lot of people in the organization are not given access to a lot of data, which is considered as confidential. And the third one is, how can we ensure compliance with various regional regulations, which this question would be interesting to hear the perspective of Marco and Mira, who are working in different regions. Now looking on the side of solutions, how have we dealt with these challenges yet? In the sense that how have we managed to leverage data despite the heavy regulations that we're facing? The first one is linked to access restriction. So basically, this is controlling the reading and editing of data objects. So this is when a user is able to read or edit a database object only if the access restrictions allow them to perform such things. Another tool that is heavily used is pseudonymization, which is a de-identification procedure where PII information are replaced by artificial identifiers or pseudonyms. And the last one is synthetic data. So it's a data that's alternative to real-world data. It's usually generated through computer simulations or algorithms. We usually generate it by applying sampling techniques to real-world data. So now what? So the idea of today is that we create a discussion where we start by identifying in a very precise manner the key challenges that are posed by data privacy regulations in the day-to-day operations, data-driven operations, and the solutions that work the best for leveraging data while complying with these heavy privacy requirements. So now I'll turn to the speakers, Marco and Mira, who certainly have an opinion on the matter and which we are here to listen to. So I would like to start with the question, maybe Mira, in your view, what do you identify as being the main challenges to data analytics posed by these privacy laws? So I mentioned a lot on the first, a few on the first slide, but there might be a lot more, and I would like to hear your view on that.
I think the biggest challenge that many organizations face is they have a wealth of data to use. There's a lot of value they could unlock to make smarter decisions or improve customer service or make efficiencies. But when they hear about these laws and the consequences of not complying, it can make the analytics appear so risky, and the compliance is so costly that they don't want to touch data analytics at all. So I think the biggest risk is just not utilizing the data and seeing the value that they could see from it, because they're just so scared of the non-compliance. There are things like reputational impact. We've all heard stories about data breaches or improper use of data that have really damaged companies. And I think that fear is the biggest challenge. Beyond that, obviously, just making sure they're complying and taking the steps to not get fined are big challenges as well.
Yeah, it's true that it's scary. Like when you hear about the fines faced by Amazon's or other company, it can make one really reluctant to touch data. Marco, maybe could we get your view on that?
Of course. I mean, I fully agree with what you said, Mira, and I think the root of the problem that we see is incomplete data, but the question, I think, is how we deal with it. And I think it's not that black and white. The legislation is not that black and white. We have a lot of gray zones in there, which is subject to the interpretations of the companies that work with it, which makes it really difficult to make the right decision. But on the other hand, we also have a loss of trust when it comes to consumers who are interfacing with products where the data could potentially be captured. And I think all of those challenges lead to one big challenge, to one big thing we need to work on, which is a change in mindset of the people who are working with the data collected. And especially in the marketing world, I think we so far we were just capturing whatever we wanted, but I think by now it's not only a matter about being compliant with the law, but also making sure that we explain to the consumers why we're collecting what data and make sure they're okay with that. And I think this is a huge change in mindset that we still need to work on a lot.
Yeah, that definitely. So it's interesting that you both identify two key challenges, and it's a good start of the conversation to start with that in mind. My second question linked to this would be one of the main issue in all these privacy topic is to maintain anonymization of product users. As you mentioned, Marco, there is a lot of a distrust and a growing distrust of people who are scared to use the product and because scared that privacy rules won't be respected. So what's in your view the best way to maintain this anonymization? Is it, so we hear a lot about masking techniques or pseudonymization, which I mentioned above, or maybe just restricting the access right to the right people? What in your view is the best way to maintain this anonymization in businesses? Maybe Marco, you can
Sure.
You can start.
I mean, I'm a consultant, so I'm gonna give a very consulting-like answer, which is it depends. And it really depends on the case. So obviously, if restricting the data, if restricting access to the data is enough, I would always go for that, because it's the better choice than losing data by doing something like masking or I think you call it masking or pseudonymization. Complicated word. You know what I mean. What we usually apply is a technique called hashing, which you might be familiar with, which I would think is a subterm of that. But still, it very much depends on the case. I also have an opinion on synthetic data. But I don't know, that might go into too much detail here. Back to the original question, I would say really depending on the use case, I would decide for the option that leaves me with the most data I have. And if I have to restrict it to only a small amount of people who work with it, I think that is still better, because then they can work with the data and perform aggregations on it and analyses that they can then share without containing any PII data. But on the raw level, I want to maintain as much data as I can, obviously.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this view. But if you go into the solution of restricting access to data, for example, would you recommend using any tool or any process that makes this easier? Because in my experience, of talking to people, I hear a lot people saying it's a nightmare because due to these access right things, when I need data right now, I need to ask for permission, and it can take up to 2 or 3 business days for people who take care of data privacy to give me this permission so I can conduct my analysis, and then access is removed again. So do you recommend doing this manually, or can you recommend any tool or processes to manage access rights? Or maybe that's too deep of a question.
I think this depends very much. I think this depends very much on how your system is structured. I think there is hardly a clear-cut answer. I think there might be tools that can potentially help. The way we usually do it is by setting up a data warehouse which has a very clear ownership and also very clear structure. So there are not that many different data owners, and within that data warehouse you could also make sure that certain areas are restricted, and new databases even allowed to go down on row level or column level restrictions. Obviously, it all depends on the management of those, but I think as long as you make sure that the set of owners is limited, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. I don't have a clear tool recommendation here for you, but
yeah, I think that's a good point. What I think to consider is, like, as an organization gets bigger and more complex, I think anonymization or pseudonymization is something you can't really get away from. Like, you know, when I was at JP Morgan, we were managing, you know, billions of records of customer private information, hundreds of people. There were different access rights, and so even if someone needed access to a name, for example, we wanted to limit them having access to what that real name was. So we had to go with anonymization. And there are definitely tools that can do that automatically. If you're working with a smaller data set, you can figure out manual rules to do that, which we've definitely done in the past. But you know, as you're scaling, then I think it's worth investing at tools that will do that. Pseudonymization is really helpful if you want to kind of maintain that thread of a person. So anonymization is where you have no idea about anything. Every record about me, for example, has a different anonymous tag attached, but pseudonymization will always have tag ABC attached to me, for example. So you can track my behavior, even though you're not tracking my name or my location or my date of birth or things that would be private. So if what you're trying to do can be achieved without any private information at all, then that's great. That makes you, like, most compliant, mitigates the risk of falling foul of these rules. If you have like really good policies and rights in place like Marco has, then that's also fantastic. But as you grow, then I think anonymization and pseudonymization are really, really good options to consider.
It's interesting. I had not thought about the difference between anonymization and pseudonymization, in the sense that you would recommend pseudonymization as it allows you to track your customers, and this is really useful in a lot of businesses. So pseudonymization is probably something that would be recommended over anonymization. And Mira, maybe another question for you. It's still linked to this idea of anonymization and not using PII data, is the question of how can we protect data while making it completely accessible for data analysis. So we've seen people using synthetic data a lot to this end, but do you think synthetic data is working? Do you think it's a good way to anonymize data? Do you think the quality of the analysis also gets at least as good as with real world data, or maybe better? Like, what have you seen in your experience?
I guess I work for a law firm, so I'll give the lawyer answer of it depends again. It depends on how you're getting that synthetic data set. Is your team trained on the differences of using synthetic versus like the raw original data? But I think, anything that is going to help you be compliant while allowing you to still do your analytics and get those insights is hugely valuable. So if it's an option for you, then, or for a company, then I would definitely recommend using it. Again, there are intricacies. When you're doing sampling, you could be missing some nuances that you need to be aware of, but it's good for getting those general insights, especially if you have a big enough data set.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Marco, do you have any thoughts on synthetic data? Do you think it's useful?
Well, I mean, I think the question is a bit what we're talking about when we speak about synthetic data. So if we have entirely synthetically generated data, I think it will be hard to apply it in a real world use case, because it can only be used for training models, which is fine, which is a use case in its own right. But I think you will have a hard time making any assumption about the business you're running or whatever, because it is in essence only artificially created data. But obviously there can be parts of synthetic data to a real data set, which then can absolutely make sense to you. So for example, this can be the extrapolation of missing data. For example, I'm losing a specific amount and then I can try to extrapolate on the rest of it. Or it can be making an assumption about a data point that I cannot access because of legal restrictions or whatever. I mean, I can give a quick example if you like it, or really like that. I mean,
yeah, that'd be great.
I'm based in Germany, so driving fast on the Autobahn is a very big topic for us, even though we might have a speed limit soon. So it will be very easy for me to create a synthetic data set about the speed the cars have there. And there will probably be a peak around 80 where all of the trucks are, and then there will probably be a peak at around 140, which is where the average person goes. But then I have maybe an outlier at 300 every once in a while, because Germans are crazy and like that. So this would be a completely artificially created data set. What would it tell me about the speed of people on the Autobahn? Nothing, because it's just what I have created, right? But if I can track only every second car, I can then maybe infer what the rest of the cars would be. So this would be the extrapolation. Or maybe if I want to introduce another dimension, I could say maybe what type of car is it probably, and then I can maybe infer from that data set that the guys driving at 80 might be trucks, and the guys driving at 300 are probably not trucks. So if that could be a data set that I don't have access to because I'm not allowed to track what kind of car it is, but only the speed. This is something that I could then infer. And this is my understanding of synthetic data. And I think extrapolation and kind of filling in related dimensions is a very relevant use case. While entirely synthetic data is probably, I don't see any other use case than training models.
Yeah, I do agree with that as well. If we move a little bit from the topic of synthetic data and anonymization, Mira, is there a specific way to structure the data warehouse to protect the data without the data warehouse becoming a mess, like putting all the PII data on one side and the non-protected data somewhere else? Or is there a specific organization that you use or recommend?
I think rights, as Marco was saying earlier, are really important. You might need to have different tables or views, some which have PI, some which don't. Again, I'd probably be a proponent of using anonymization just to keep things streamlined, avoid confusion as people are using different tables and changing the models. But I think the other thing to really focus on is data minimization. There's a huge tendency among data science and analytics professionals to think like the more data, the better. But really, if you don't need, like, do you really need my name to predict what product I want to buy, for example? You just need that pseudonym. And in that case, I would advise just getting rid of my name completely, and then you don't have that risk and you don't have to wait 2 business days to get the right permissions and things like that. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And Marco, I feel like you will agree. You will agree with this, but do you have any other recommendations not to make the data warehouse a mess?
I do very much agree, indeed. I think there are all of the points I would 100% agree on. I think data warehouses can become very messy in general, having PIA data or not, and I think it depends very much on the structure you're working with. So if you don't have a proper structure, it doesn't even matter if you have to deal with sensitive data or not. It will get messy. So what we usually employ is a structure where we have different layers, and we have one layer where all of the raw data comes in, and then we have one layer where we combine the raw data into objects. And this is very important because this is where we perform a logical clustering of the data, and this allows us to give the whole thing a lot more structure and have like a data-wise representation of an organization within our database. And this allows us also to make sure we restricting certain data points is much easier, because then I might just restrict entire of these business objects, or I might restrict parts of those, or I might also just put things into separate objects that are supposed to be restricted. And having such a structure makes things much easier than just trying to dump in all of the raw data and performing analyses on these. And I fully agree, Mira, with your point. Especially data science people usually want to have everything in some raw file format, which is fine. But I think it makes structuring much harder, and maybe sometimes taking a structuring step in between would actually be better, also for data science applications.
Yeah, definitely. We hear a lot about bringing a more engineering way of doing things to the data science practice, that it would bring a lot of good on the structure side of things. And still linked to the data warehouse, Marco, do you think it's better to host solely for privacy purposes? Is it better to host data on premise or on the cloud? I've heard that on the cloud it can cause a lot of issues linked to ad blockers. Yeah, do you have an opinion on this?
I think it only matters for legal reasons. So there are certainly companies that we work with who need on-prem hosting, maybe because they're in a more sensitive industry, or it's just their own data protection policy. Generally, when it comes to tracking, which I think is what you're referring to, it doesn't make any difference whether it's on-prem or cloud. I think what makes a difference is whether it is hosted or self-hosted, because the ad blockers currently work on the domain. So if you track something to a domain that you don't own, the ad blockers might react to that because they might recognize the domain as belonging to one of the tracking tools, e.g. Google Analytics, whatever, you name it. But you can, if you have a self-hosted solution, you can set it to whatever domain you want. So in that regard, I don't think it makes a difference. In the future, ad blockers, and some of them already do, will also react on what kind of code you're executing, and not only on the domain, but also then it doesn't matter if you have that on an on-prem server, on a cloud server. It's much more about whether you have control about the system that you're running or not. And there, it doesn't make any difference if the server is hosted in your basement or somewhere in the cloud.
Yeah. Okay, and Mira, what do you feel about this?
Yeah, I agree with Marco. I think one thing I'm aware of, being from a law firm, is that if you're storing your data in a cloud service, then in theory, anyone could subpoena that cloud provider and ask for your data. And there's not so much you can do to stop it. Whereas if you have it on-prem, then you have more control as to what could be provided to a subpoena request. So that's one thing to be thinking about. And then the other thing to be thinking about with cloud is just making sure that you have the right people managing those accesses. It would be really easy for someone to accidentally, change the privacy settings or expose data if they're not sure what they're doing and they get access to configuring those settings. But yeah, I mean, otherwise, I think Marco covered most of it.
Okay, thank you. Looking at we're getting to the interesting questions where it comes to differences between regions. Maybe one big problem with data privacy regulation is that they differ across countries, but businesses usually collect data from different countries and end up having to comply to data privacy regulations from a few different countries. So when running an organization across a few countries, how can one efficiently provide compliance with these varying regional laws regarding data privacy? Maybe Mira, you can start with this one.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, coming from the US, most of our states have less strict privacy laws than you have in the EU. California has pretty tight regulations, but generally it's less. But as you say, Louise, we're collecting data from all over the world, and so we're bound by GDPR as well. And one of the things we had to work out was a lot of the data we're collecting, we're not sure where the owner resides, so we have to treat that as being governed by GDPR as well. They could be in the EU or they could not, so we have to assume they are. So that's one thing that we have to do, like realize that we have to apply these global rules to all of our data, even if someone maybe isn't from the EU. And what we landed on was really just figuring out what are the strictest requirements for all of these regulations that we're governed under, and trying to comply with that strictest one. And that kind of helps ensure that we're compliant, we're mitigated against the risk of breaching any of these laws. Some people might want to evaluate all of the things they have to comply with against the risk of being found non-compliant and then the penalty. And some people are just going to decide it's worth taking that risk. So it's really kind of an organizational approach if they feel like the fine isn't worth them spending all the time and money getting compliant. But what we landed on was really figuring out what is the most strict requirement and getting compliant with that.
It's actually really clever to identify the strictest requirement and comply with this, because you're only getting familiar with one requirement, and you don't have to get your head wrapped around all of them. Marco, what would be your advices when looking at this question?
Yeah, actually, I share the same approach. I would also take the strictest regulation as the governing one, which is why I think I would rather now provide the operational side of this, and talk a bit about how this could be technically resolved. And I think on one hand, content management systems can really help to make sure your tracking and what you're tracking on the website is adapted to each country, and there are systems on the market which would also automatically adapt to the country. Obviously there are certain restrictions and it doesn't work 100%, but those tools definitely can help. Then on the other hand, when still talking about web tracking, I think having a tag management system in place properly definitely helps a great deal, because it allows you to deploy codes efficiently and differently depending on what version of the site somebody is loading. And then when we speak more about the data infrastructure side of things, it might also make sense to host individual data warehouses in the target countries, and then to combine only the aggregated data in the main hub, so to say.
Yeah, that's another great piece of advice, to have a few data warehouses. I mean, one in each country you're operating, so you can ensure you're compliant in each of these countries. There's already no, maybe we'll tackle this question in the chat at the end, after the last question, which we're coming to, regarding the idea of reconciling privacy and data analysis in a effortless manner. Are you finding any tool or category of tool specifically helpful? Maybe Margaret, you can start on that.
Of course, I mean, most of the statistical analysis and the extrapolation, all of the methods mentioned before, we would do with Python, which is probably no surprise to anyone here. Then mentioning tools, I guess you might be aware of Matomo, which is a web tracking tool which can be self-hosted and is open source. So that is something which is definitely gaining a lot more traction by now, because it allows you to host your own tracking and take the full ownership of the data. And then there is a tool which you might not know, which is called Blotout. They're actually from California, and I think due to the restrictive data privacy regulations there, they built a tool which is also very suitable for the European market. And they put a lot of emphasis on data privacy and making sure this still works within the global data infrastructure, so to say. So we're actually big fans of that tool, and I think we'll see a lot more like that coming.
Yeah, definitely. As regulation continue to become more stringent, hopefully there will be more tools to make it easier for organization. And Mira, is there any tool you can recommend, or you've been using, or you've seen being used in your various analytics teams?
Yeah, I think the category of tool is probably the anonymization or pseudonymization tools, finding those that can make those changes as early as possible to limit anyone having access to that private information. Again, having really strong tracking of like code changes. So using something like Git, I think is helpful to make sure that your code is secure and that people aren't making unregulated or unauthorized changes. But yeah, otherwise, fully agree with Marco.
Okay, and this was my last question. So probably we can have a few, small Q&A time. So if anyone in the room has questions, you can put them in the chat, and I will make sure they're asked. And Marco and Mira, if you have questions for each other as well, well, it's the time. So there was a question from Vishal in the chat about creating a structure layer and restricting access. So that mentioned that it's a good idea, and his question was, do you perform anonymization, pseudonymization at the raw data layer or at the staging layer? Yes, so that was for Marco.
Well, I would definitely prefer to do it at a later stage because it will be easier. But I don't think it would be compliant then because you're technically not allowed to store it. So I think you should try to perform it as close to the source as possible, even though it will obviously get harder because it's easier to deal with already structured and organized data.
Okay, thank you. Anyone has another question? Marco and Mira have any question for each other, or do you think we've covered it all?
I mean, I would be very curious to hear from you, Mira, what your perception of the GDPR is, because I mean, for us it's already a burden, as you might imagine, but I'm really wondering what US companies think about what the crazy Europeans do over there, and whether this is something you want to be involved with, or you'd rather say, okay, then let's leave those guys do whatever they want.
Well, I'm English, so I guess I'm kind of more partial to the EU anyway than the typical American would be. But yeah, I think the view is like generally it's very burdensome, not necessary. Starting to come around to it, especially with CCPA. California is kind of starting to mimic GDPR. I think the biggest struggle we've seen is kind of lack of clarity. Like, for example, for a long time, there was a long question as to whether pseudonymization was enough. Like if someone requested that we delete their data, but they were pseudonymized, then did we really have to delete it since there was no way to track it back to them? So things are still changing. I know they just made another announcement about the regulation might be changing. It's kind of unclear as to how that will be, but I think the US is receptive to that. It looks like it will be easier to comply with over the next year or so. So I mean, I'm on board with it. I think protecting people's data privacy is the right thing to do. I think it's going to be a differentiator for businesses. If they can say we're protecting your data, then probably a consumer will be more likely to go with them versus a competitor. So I'm in favor of it, but it is a little cumbersome.
I think there's a question in the audience as well.
Yes, we've got another question. How do you deal with your customer request on data deletion? Who wants to get this one?
I mean, I can give an answer. It's definitely not an easy topic, because the problem with data deletion is that you need to delete it across all systems, and this is the one of the points that I always found a bit counterintuitive about a GDPR, because they kind of tell you that you need to respect all of the data of the consumer, but on the other hand, it also forces you to make sure all of it is controllable through one system, which is at least in my opinion a bit counterintuitive. But the thing is, it's obviously hard, because if you have a deletion request, you need to make sure that it gets also deleted across all of the systems, and this is not so easy, because you don't always have the same identifiers, and can make sure that you can actually make sure that all of the individual records across different systems get deleted when a request comes. So it's a solvable problem, but it's definitely one that can take considerable effort.
Yeah, and it's definitely a problem. Like I remember the face I displayed when a hotel told me that it was impossible for them to delete my credit card records. I was like, how is this impossible? And actually, there's a lot of complications to delete a record, even when a customer asks it, to the despair of a lot of people. Do we have any more question? If not, we can end with a positive message from Naomi, who wanted to thank everyone for their time, and she's a fresh grad entering her first day job and found this really valuable. So hope this was as valuable for everyone. It was for Naomi, and thank you, Marco and Mira, for your time, and everyone else for coming.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great evening, Marco, and Mira, great afternoon.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Bye. Ciao.